Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.
Andrew, what's going on, my friend?
Tash, how are you, buddy? Thanks for having me.
How you doing, brother? It's been a while.
I know, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm fantastic. Since the last time I seen you, you've had some life changes. It sounds like you're down in Florida now.
Yeah, a lot of life changes down in Florida, but still doing my thing, betting all day, every day. So it's been a lot of fun, and Dub Club's been a great platform for me. So I'm really excited about the new app, and yeah, looking forward to catching up today.
Good to hear, and congrats on the move. Super exciting. And yes, you have been doing your thing when it comes to betting. I've been tailing you. You hit like a plus 375 dog last week, and it was the longest straight play I've ever hit. So thank you for that. But hey, man, let's dive into it. I want to hear, we got dinner out in the city. I heard your whole backstory. I know that our listeners will love to hear it. So let's just kind of dive in from the start. You've now become one of, if not, the biggest names in the industry when it comes to handicapping the UFC. How'd you get your start?
Yeah, so I wrestled between the time I was 5 years old and the time I was 22 years old. So the majority of my life, I'm 26 now, and it was a pretty seamless transition from wrestling to MMA in terms of like being a fan. I started out as a fan. I was very casual when I was in like high school and Chris Weidman fought Anderson Silva. I was into it because Weidman was a wrestler. And then once the McGregor era hit, like I just got hooked. Like I became a hardcore fan, and I loved trying to predict the fights, like thinking, I was passionate about who I thought was going to win. And like even when I was in high school, I was a teenager, and this was before I was like old enough to have a credit card. I even used to give my dad like $50 cash that I had made from chores, and he would put $50 into a betting account for me, and I would bet on the fights on Saturday night. And so it started that young, and then I started to take it more seriously when I was in college. I was 20 years old, I want to say, when I started like really diving in, like tracking my bets, releasing my bets, having people tail me, and it's just been a roller coaster since then. And yeah, this is my 6th year with bets being tracked publicly, and it's just went from something I had 100 followers in, and I was betting $100, $200, $300 a fight, and it's something I now do for a living. I have 11,000 Twitter followers, a few hundred people subscribe to my picks, so it's been a crazy journey, and I feel like the best is yet to come. So I'm still excited for the future. I feel like it's just going to keep growing and growing. And yeah, I eat, sleep, and breathe it every day, and I'll continue to do that.
That's the amazing thing is, like, I just talked about you moving into your new home. Like, you are a true handicapper. You purchased this new home with your betting winnings. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
That is unbelievable. You and me are in far different sides of the spectrum when it comes to winning and losing, other than, when I'm tailing Dub Club handicappers. Anything I place on my own never really ends up well. But hey, another funny story that you had told me when we got dinner was getting limited on books just purely based off kind of your handicapping winnings. What was that process like, getting told by DraftKings and others that you were no longer welcome placing action there?
Yeah, so the first time it happened to me, I thought it was cool, and then every time it's happened since then, it's been really frustrating. But there's I can't say too much, but you have to be creative when you get to the point that I've gotten to, and I'm still able to get down a lot of money, so I'm fortunate in that aspect. And my hope is that over time, with gambling becoming more regulated, that books will have to adhere to some sort of policy in the future where they can't limit and ban people for being winning sports bettors, because obviously these books, DraftKings, FanDuel, are trying to make money, which that's obviously the point of running a business. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's a way to do that without limiting winning bettors. They try to appeal to people that think, I think the Eagles are going to win tonight, so I'm going to bet on them. Like it's not that simple. They know it's not that simple. They'd rather spend millions of dollars advertising trying to appeal to the casual bettor than having actual sharp bettors on their book. And the best bookmakers I know welcome sharp money, and they use it to their advantage. If seriously, the absolute best bookmakers that I have ever met are ones that they want your money. They want to know what I'm on. They want to know what I'm betting for UFC. They want to know what number I'm betting it at, how big I'm betting it, and then they can adjust their lines from there and use that information. Whereas DraftKings and FanDuel, they don't know how to book winning bettors. So instead of using my information to their benefit, they'll just say, we don't want you at all. And they're kind of just flying by the seat of their pants, trying to copy what other sharp books are doing rather than just actually being able to say, okay, here's the information I have in front of me. This is what the sharp bettors are betting. Let me adjust the line based on what they bet. And that way we can make our line tighter rather than them being like, oh, this book moved 10 cents, so I'm going to move 10 cents. Like, it's just, I'm not trying to be rude when I say this, but it's like amateur hour at some of these domestic books. And my hope is that over time that the issue gets corrected. But nonetheless, we are, what's the word I'm looking for? We're creative and we adapt and move forward.
Hey, you touched upon a lot of interesting stuff in there, but most importantly, like, how did you get to the point that you were the sharp? Where, like, you know, people are potentially subscribing to your Dub Club just so they can see what you're on. And when I say people, I mean bookmakers. Like, how did you get to the point where you were predicting the outcome of UFC fights at such a high rate that people were really taking notice of you?
I genuinely just credit it to, I was obsessed with it. I naturally have a good eye for grappling. Obviously, having that extensive wrestling background, I always understood what I was looking at, and just spending the last however many years breaking down striking, grappling, like, I understand the sport. I've picked up on certain trends, and like I said, it's just a ton of practice. Like, I sit here all day and I watch fights. I look at market trends. I watch how lines move. I understand why they move. I look at past results and compare and try to analyze them based on, okay, yeah, this might have happened in one iteration of this fight, but if they fought 100 times, how would it have gone? Or 1,000 times, how would it have gone over a bigger sample size? And yeah, I just, to put it in the most simple way possible, I just eat, slept, and breathed it for the last however many years. And I got to the point where I was just so I was like so obsessed with it that it was all I did. And I, like, when you're that determined at something, like, success is kind of inevitable. And I also have always credited a lot of my success to, like, always wanting to be better. Like, even when I do think I'm the best or one of the best or whatever you want to call it, like, I always am, like, even to this day, like, I still want to learn. I still want to get better. Like, the market's always evolving. There were edges a few years ago that have came and went, and there's always going to be more. And so you have to adapt as a better. And yeah, you have to adapt like the market adapts, or else you'll get passed by. I've seen so many people, and, like, when I mean so many people, like, it's countless, who came into the space, had a couple good years, had a hot run, and kind of just fizzled out. Now they're no longer in the space, or they don't do this anymore, they don't do that anymore. Whereas I am always trying to evolve, and the goal for me is to do this for the rest of my life. I'm not trying to hit some hot streak and say, oh, I hit a 10-unit max whale play. Like, I'm hoping to be profitable over my next 1,000 bets, 2,000 bets, 5,000 bets, because that's really what it means to be a winning plus EV bettor, is having an edge over a large sample size. So I'm always trying to adapt. I'm always trying to improve. And yeah, I've made it my life. And so that's what I contribute. That's kind of how it all started to come together. And that's exactly the same strategy I use now moving forward.
Something that I find incredibly interesting about UFC versus baseball, basketball, football is I've never really watched much UFC, but it doesn't seem like there is necessarily data that you can analyze in order to determine, like, positive EV bets. Like, in my brain, you are the EV calculator. Like, your brain is processing information to find value. There's no algorithm that you can punch in number of punches landed in the last 20 fights like you could number of three-pointers made in the last 30 games or 20 games, whatever it may be. How are you finding such tremendous value?
Yeah, and you know what it is about the stats, too? If you're handicapping, say, let's use baseball for an example. There's 162 games a year. Players are getting 3-4 at-bats a game. MMA in the UFC, you might fight 3 times a year. So it's not even really a meaningful sample size in terms of data. And so much of the data is skewed based on level of competition that the data becomes meaningless if you don't know how to interpret it. And what I mean by that is I could say, okay, this guy outlanded his opponent 100-30 in his last fight. But if I don't go further than that, I could say, okay, if I did go further than that, I could say, okay, well, this guy's opponent was 0-12, and he's more of a grappler anyway, so it doesn't really matter that he outlanded him that much. Whereas this fighter might have outlanded his opponent maybe only 50-30, but he's a 10-4 fighter, and he's 2-1 in the UFC, and he's fought much better competition. So, and he's actually a striker. So it's just about analyzing the right data and knowing how to interpret it. And I'm someone who used, like, when I say zero data, no stats, no metrics, no nothing for years. Like, I was fully by what I saw, like, with my own 2 eyes. And I'd say over the last year or two, I've kind of adapted my approach to where it's not necessarily 100-0 anymore. It's more like 90-10 or 85-15. Like, I still don't use and everyone's different. I'm just not a stats guy in general because I personally think a lot of the stats that are out there are already baked into the line. And as a handicapper, I'm trying to find, okay, what's not being factored into this line right now? Like, you're -110, I'm -110, but I think you should be a -150 favorite. Like, why do other people not see it that way? What am I seeing that they're not? And it might be something that can't be calculated in a stat. It might be, okay, when I shoot a takedown, your takedown defense is really, really good, but you just so happen to fight the best wrestler in the world in your last fight, and that's why you gave up a couple takedowns. Like, it could be something like so simple like that that's not being factored into the line, and it's always something different too. It could be, okay, this fighter was really good, but his last fight was 3 years ago, and he's 38 now instead of 35, and people are still treating it like he's still in his prime. It could be anything like that, but I personally am always trying to find what's not being factored into the line, and I think that a lot of times with stats, it's already kind of been adjusted for.
Yeah, you're essentially the human algorithm. Like, you are pulling data points that people physically can't unless they're studying the ins and outs of every single fighter. That's why I enjoy tailing you so much. Something that's hilarious is you hear a lot of people talk about moving lines, but, like, you legitimately do it. If I get a notification that you released a play, I know that I have to get that in within the next hour. Otherwise, the line's going to move, 50 cents at least. And so one of my favorite things that you do in your publishing is you set these barriers for, like, where the value ends. How do you determine that? And you can explain it better than I probably can, what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so a perfect example, let's say fighter A and fighter B are both -110 aside. I cap fighter A at, say, 60%, which is -150. So I'll make my bet, and immediately after I'll send out the bet to everyone else, and I'll say, I think fighter A, there's value. I'll break down the fight. Fighter A, the better striker, the better grappler, whatever. I think there's value on this fight because of XYZ. And then I'll recommend how big to go on the bet, and I typically use like a 1 to 5 unit scale, and I'll say I think there's value on this line. Odds are good for 1 unit up until -122, which is 55% implied. So I'm kind of giving a barrier because to the point where I still think there's enough value for other people to bet it. Whereas, like, if the line moves all the way up to -135, -140, there's not really enough value to be betting it anymore if you're only a percent or two away from what I cap the line. It also has to do with a multitude of things. It's where I cap the line, where the line has already been. Like, if the -110 was +125 at one point and I'm giving it out at -110, like, I obviously try to avoid that at all costs, but if it does happen, I'm not going to give -110 out as a big bet when we could have gotten +125 because we're giving away a ton of value. So if anything at all, it's going to be a smaller bet. Whereas if I think we're getting the best of the number, which is what I tend to do every 95 out of 100 times or so, like, we want to be bigger in those spots. And so it's a mixture of confidence interval, where the true line, in my opinion, versus what the line actually is, and, like, where the line has moved and where I see it moving. So it's based on those calculate, like that's why it's never the exact same. I could have a 1 unit bet at minus 120 that I think is good all the way until minus 165 because of it could. I might have more or less of a confidence interval, whereas I know like at the I could see another fight where the floor of that line is like minus 165, whereas another one like the ceiling could be minus 165. So there's a lot that goes into it, but I try to do all of that for my followers. That way they don't have to overthink this. I'm saying, look, here's what I'm betting. This is how much I'm betting it for. This is why I'm betting it. Like I want to take the guesswork out. I want to take out you doing any work. Like I'll do my job, you do yours, and we'll do good things together. So that's how I approach it. Obviously, if I could teach people along the way, I love doing that also. But I try to also set parameters to. I want to tee people up for success. Like I don't sell picks or give picks out like for any other reason. Like obviously, it's good extra money to have, but I want you to win, and like I want you to approach sports betting in a plus EV manner rather than just. It'd be fight night, it'd be 10 o'clock and the fights are starting and you're firing on this bet and this bet because, oh, this guy is so good and I saw him do an interview and he sounds really scary. Like, it's just not how you win. And so I want to help people win, and I don't want to just give out picks and say, oh, whatever you play the line at, like, oh, so-and-so's a lock. Like, no, it's not. I have him at 55% because I cap him at 62.5%. And so I think you should bet it up until 57.5%. So that's a long way to answer that question. But I'm trying to tee people up to win is long story short.
What you do is you could not make it more simple. You say bet for 2 units, up until this line. And then once you cross that line, we're going to take it for 1 unit. And if you don't get that line either, don't bet it at all. And so what do? I get the notification. I go to my book, I see, okay, we're still in the range of 2 units, and I'll place it. Like, it could not be easier. I told you before we hopped on the call, I had, watched UFC casually, but I'd never really bet on it. And now it's become my favorite Saturday activity. 1, because it's fun cashing tickets, and you do that at a super high rate. And 2, it's just an entertaining sport to watch. And so that's really just a testament to you. I would love to kind of dive into how you feel like your background being an athlete, essentially in a similar sport with your background in wrestling, how that's impacted your ability and how that translates over to UFC.
Yeah, I would say it's not something I can rely on solely, but like that was the initial foundation that I started building this whole thing off of. Is I used to focus on fights where, and I still do to an extent. Obviously, I've widened my range of having an edge, but my initial edge was like, I think this guy could take this guy down more than the line implies, or vice versa. And that was where my initial edge came from. Is like I understood the levels of grappling and like the ins and outs, the techniques, the little things that the average person, not more than the average person, the average capper might not pick up. The average bettor like probably isn't going to pick that up. They might just see like, okay, this guy shot a takedown, but it's like, yeah, how did he set up the takedown? How did he finish the takedown? How did he chain the 2 takedowns together? And so having wrestled for 17 years or whatever it was, I kind of was able to just have a better eye for the grappling than 99.9% of people. And in my own experience, like I was a pretty good wrestler. I wasn't like amazing or anything, but I always had an edge in wrestling IQ or mat awareness, as some would call it. And so I would beat kids that were stronger than me or faster than me because I was smarter than them in terms of having a high wrestling IQ, of like knowing what to do in certain positions, or knowing like, okay, we're here on the mat, and so I'm going to shoot you out of bounds and the ref's going to hit you for stalling. Like stuff like that, where people were just kind of like a bull going at a red handkerchief, where it's like, I was always like very thoughtful in my approach. I always had, in my opinion, had a high wrestling IQ, and I think that's what translated so well to MMA. Is it's very similar. It's very, very similar in being able to try to make reads in the grappling and see who has smart grappling IQs, or who might have scrambled out of this because they're athletic, but if they face someone with better technique, like it's not going to work on them. And it's just anywhere you could find a little edge like that is huge. But that's where I found my initial edge, was I would watch grappling exchanges and I could say, oh, this guy knows what he's doing, and this guy just this guy knows wrestling fundamentals really well, whereas this guy just trains it twice a week in the gym, and he kind of might get by, might not. And so it's a huge difference. And that's one I mentioned earlier about some edges coming and going. Like, that's one edge that I don't think will ever go away for me.
That's what's so fun, and I think part of the reason that I've gotten so into watching UFC is like knowing that you understand those little details, so I don't have to worry about them. Because there were times that I'll see you take something, I turn it on, I'm watching it, and there's some absolute behemoth of a human being with muscles popping out of muscles, and then you see some little scrawny guy that just it looks like he's half the size, and the scrawny guy ends up winning just because you understand those little intricacies and those little details that actually go into, winning fights, not just looking the part. Last question for you is something that you touched upon a couple questions ago, was your unit scale being 1 to 5. I have tailed you for probably 5 months now, going on 5 months, and I think that there have been a handful of 3 units and maybe 1 4 unit. What does it take to find that 5 unit spot?
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad you said that, because that's another thing I wanted to touch on. This year I haven't gone above 3 units once. And as you know, I specify in my breakdowns. For favorites, we're doing to win 1 unit, to win 2 units, to win 3 units. Underdogs, it's risk 1 unit, risk 2 units, risk 3 units. And I've had 3 3-unit bets this year, if my memory serves me correct. And they were on Aaron Blanchfield's. It was Aaron Blanchfield, Max Holloway, and Piotr Jan. So 2 and 1 in those bigger bets. I had 2 5-unit bets last year. It was Rose Namajunas against Carla Esparza and Dustin Jacoby against Da-Un Jung. So those were my 2 5-unit bets last year. Both those happened to win. But there's been times in the past where I've had 5-unit bets lose. Obviously, like, I have like a 2,000 bet sample size, so there's going to be plenty of ups and downs. But the thing for me is, like, if I'm betting more than, I'd say, and tell me if you agree, I'd say 90% of my bets are 1 or 2 units, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just, I'm being so mindful of variance. I'm being mindful of all the different outcomes that can happen. And when I do go big, I want it to be, it has to check so many boxes for me. Like, I'll if you don't mind, I'll dive into the example of Max Holloway versus Arnold Allen, because that was my most recent 3-unit bet. And it checked so many boxes for me. Like, Max Holloway had fought the better competition. He was coming off of a loss to Volkanovski, who's the champ, so the market was undervaluing him. Arnold Allen had never fought in a 5-round fight before, so Max Holloway has 5-round experience. He always has as good or better cardio than his opponents, whereas Arnold Allen had faded in round 3s in the past. You had narratives out there that, like, Max Holloway might be washed, and if you look at it short-sighted, it's like, okay, he lost his last fight, and he doesn't usually lose, but he lost to Alexander Volkanovski, who's literally the pound-for-pound #1 fighter right now in the world. And so, it's, like I said earlier, being able to, like, that's the data, and now you're being able to kind of process it and interpret the data. And whereas Arnold Allen, his last couple wins, like, one was against Calvin Kattar, who it was an injury win, and one was against Dan Hooker trying to come down to 145, which was a quick knockout. And you can't always take too much away from a quick knockout in MMA because it's just one iteration. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a thousand iterations of it, what happens if that first round knockout doesn't happen? Like, how does his cardio hold up? How does his grappling hold up? And that's another box I checked in the Holloway column, is Arnold Allen doesn't pose much of a grappling threat. So in my head, I was like, Arnold Allen is statistically a worse striker. He's fought worse competition. He doesn't have 5-round cardio. He doesn't have 5-round experience. So he, more often than not, is going to have to knock Max Holloway out, who's literally never been knocked out in his entire UFC career. And so it was just like, check, check, check. Like, for me, that checked off so many boxes. And that's why I went 3 units on that bet, as opposed to 1 unit or 2 units. And even then, like even all those boxes being checked, I didn't go 5 units because or 4 units or 5 units, because there's certain things I look for when I go 4 units or 5 units. Max Holloway is not a grappler. He's not an offensive wrestler. Typically when I'm going that big, I want that to be in my wheelhouse. Like my A+ bread and butter game is when someone has a distinct grappling advantage. And striking in general is higher variance, higher volatility than grappling. Like 2 fighters might fight and one's 3 times the striker of the other, but the lesser striker could land a knockout punch. Whereas in grappling, like if the number 1 guy in the world wrestles the number 2 guy in the world 10 times, like he might beat him 9 out of 10 times, because like grappling is it's not that high volatility. There's no like there's no like lower percentage knockouts or like exchanges where one guy could hit the other guy clean. It's just like 2 different worlds. So when I'm betting a striking fight, I'm always mindful that striking fights are higher variance than grappling fights. So that's why I went 3 units on Max Holloway. That's just like a little insight into kind of where my thinking was for that and why I ended up going 3 units on that bet as opposed to 1 unit or 2 units, which is what I normally bet.
Yeah, that's an awesome little peek behind the curtain because, I subscribe, I get the plays, I read the write-up, I go place the bet. Like, that's where my part in this process ends. But it's super fun seeing actually what goes on behind the scenes. You literally are the human computer, which is unbelievable. What were you going to say? I almost cut you off.
No. I was just going to say, and what you said right there is exactly why I like doing the write-ups. I could so easily just say, bet Max Holloway, 3 units, and that be the end of it. But I want people to know why I'm making this bet. I want them to know what edges that I think we have in this bet. So when they watch the fight, they are understanding what we're looking for. And just when they're going to, at the end of the day, you're the one that has to click the button. Like you're confident in why we're clicking the button and knowing that I'm just not like, oh, I think Max Holloway is going to win, so here's a 3 unit bet on him at -145. It's like, no, here are the distinct advantages we have. Like I think that aren't being priced into the line correctly. So that's why I always try to be very detailed in my write-ups and tell people why, not just what bet we're making, but why we're making the bet. And if I were on the other side of it, if I was telling someone else, I'd want to know why we're making the bet. If I was telling you in baseball and you sent out Orioles +140, I could say, okay, I could tell that, but like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, that's just another reason that I enjoy tailing you is because even when there are the occasional losses, you're not perfect by any means. You do hit it.
Oh yeah, bro,
more bets than you lose.
I lose
but it feels good knowing that like there was tremendous thought that went into this, and there was like true reasoning behind it, and you provide that in the write-ups, and you provide it when you make media appearances like this. And so I've never had so much fun betting on a sport, watching a sport. Never cashed so many plus money tickets, so that's been fun. And my bankroll has grown significantly since I started tailing you. So anybody listening, please go check Andrew out. He truly is one of the best in the business. Andrew, thank you so much for taking some time today, and we'll have to do a UFC preview of a fight night coming up.
Anytime, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate all you guys are doing and giving me the platform, making it really easy for my subscribers to tail me. And yeah, thanks again.
Comes the money.